So in my recent coverage of Mr. Beast, people have been referring to me as the Muad'Dib, the Listen al-Gaib. And I have to admit, it does look like I can see the future, and I am a prophet of the downfall of Mr. Beast, but while I was predicting his downfall back in 2021, I also watched Dune Part I, and I'd never read the books, I'd never watched the David Lynch movie. I really had no exposure to this series, to this franchise, and honestly, after Part 1, I didn't even rewatch it, and I just liked the movie, and that was it. But with Part 2, obviously came out this year, loved it, quickly read the first book afterwards, and then I thought, why don't I just read the series? What's the point in waiting for the movie? It's so far off. And I quickly devoured Messiah, Children of Dune, and God Emperor within about a month and a half. And while reading all these books, I had some thoughts about the people who like them, and I am one of the people who likes them. But Elon Musk is another person who likes them, and Grimes is another person who's obsessed with Dune, and Richard Spencer is another person who loves Dune. And today I want to talk about why fascists are attracted to the world of Dune. Now, that is, of course, if you're not 10 years old, that's not to say only fascists like Dune, because Dune isn't a series pushing a fascist political message. But when you have a world so grand in scope like Dune or Lord of the Rings, obviously the death of the author comes into play, and different political groups are going to project their political views onto the world as they see it. And I've made a video in the past about Lord of the Rings because that has long had a fascist audience. And if you've watched my older videos, and I might make another one, because JD Vance has also said he loves Lord of the Rings, I think the world of Tolkien is far riper for a fascist interpretation than the world of Dune. But Frank Herbert was a libertarian who absolutely loved Islam. And the book has even contradicting messages in itself. It's a very rich world, and if you interpret it in a certain way, I guess I can see why fascists like this, because there's so much to do with bloodlines, breeding, genetic memory, like it's an Assassin's Creed game, but it's also very compatible if you see it in a positive way with fascist rhetoric. I remember Matt Walsh was recently talking about people who choose not to have children, and he acts like your genetics are some sort of Dune/Assassin's Creed things, where it's you're passing down your genetic legacy, which comes with all this historical legacy.
They're so dedicated to this calling, so intent on consumption, that they are willing to end their own bloodlines to pursue it. His ancestors fought and struggled and persevered and pioneered and bled and suffered, all so that he could exist, all for him. And he turns back to those people, to his ancestors, to his blood, and he says, yeah, sorry guys, we're done. We're done here. I'm going to end the bloodline right here. I'd rather have some extra spending cash to buy Doritos, I've decided. He stands now at the end of a procession that stretches back into the ancient past. We all do, right? Every single one of us. A line of people who made his very existence possible. Though, of course, I realize that this man would be totally mystified by the notion that he has any responsibility at all to his family, his ancestry, his bloodline.
It's a very bizarre thing that conservatives love, but I firmly believe that Elon Musk is very much influenced by these concepts in the Dune series, the Bene Gesserit breeding program, Leto II's breeding program, and the Golden Path as well. I genuinely think Elon probably considers himself someone who's putting humanity onto the Golden Path itself, and he probably thinks in Dune God Emperor that the ends justify the means, which is all down to interpretation. And if you see 3,000 years of totalitarian galactic government as a good thing to avoid dire consequences for the human race, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Why this work, this franchise, attracts far-right types. But yeah, I'm also a communist who likes it, so we're going to talk about that as well. Now, before we go any further, just a couple things. In this video, I'm going to be talking about, obviously, the first Dune book, but also Dune Messiah, Children of Dune, and Dune God Emperor. So if you watched Dune Part II and you wanted to see a sequel to that without spoilers, don't watch this video. I will say, I don't think the third Dune movie will really be like Dune Messiah, just because they changed Chani's whole character, so it seems kind of hard to follow the book completely, especially with other stuff they've taken out. There's going to be spoilers. I'm going to talk about you know, what happens to some of your favorite characters from the movie. So yeah, don't watch this video. And also because I haven't actually been shouting this out recently. But yeah, if you want to support my channel going forward, consider becoming a patron, trying to build up as many $1 to $3 patrons as possible. And benefits include getting early access to most videos and also getting access to the private patrons Discord server, and also follow me on social media, in particular Instagram. So like I said, I'm a left-wing person who really likes Dune, but it's also something I didn't have much interest in until the movies from one of my favorite directors. You know, Blade Runner 2049 is my favorite movie. So I firmly come into the Dune franchise after watching the interpretation of a left-wing director, and also drawing the parallels of his work releasing during, you know, certain periods of history, like 2021, what Israel was doing to Gaza, 2024, what Israel are doing to Gaza. And I'm watching this while that's all happening, and he's saying this is like a critique of capitalism and stuff like that. So that's how I entered Dune, because of this more left-wing interpretation. And then you read something like Dune, and I think with the first Dune in particular, I think that is more compatible with a left-wing reading, because it is all about like these feudal houses fighting over something that gives them the most, I don't know, power in the galaxy, and that is spice. Spice, which is used for a whole host of things, but most importantly, it's used by the guild navigators to see the future so they can fly the ships through space. It's used by people to see the future. It's used by people to extend their lives. And in the Fremen diet, they're eating this all the time. They're drinking it all the time. It's what gives them their blue eyes. But obviously, when you think about the time that's written, it feels like it's meant to be oil. And CHOAM, the group that controls the spice flow, seems like OPEC, and especially when you're setting it in a desert planet like Arrakis, it's really hard not to draw parallels with Arab countries in the 1960s, especially when Frank Herbert so clearly loves Islam. And it's very, very clear in the books that the Fremen are essentially space Muslims. Now, I screenshotted this when I was reading some of the Dune books to just make it very clear. There's so much explicit references to Islam in Dune. It feels actually kind of bizarre that Villeneuve downplayed it so much, despite using Arabic and some references to like the Mahdi and Arabic figures. This is like a paragraph from Dune God Emperor, and this is Leto Atreides thinking this. So, Muriz brought the ornithopter in over Sherlock with a practiced ease. Leto, seated beside him, felt the armed presence of Bihalef behind them. Everything went on trust now, and the narrow thread of his vision to which he clung. If that failed, Allahu Akbar, sometimes one had to submit to a greater order. So that is the son of Paul Atreides, who is born on Arrakis and is raised like purely Fremen by Stilgar, right? And you have Paul Atreides, he observes Ramadan. It's clearly they're wearing dress that is traditional in Arabic cultures. So when you read all of that, especially in the first Dune book, it does seem like it's maybe a story about European colonialism, especially when the Fremen shout the slogan of the Algerian Revolution. So when you have all of that anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, and some anti-capitalism as well, you can understand why leftists like the Dune series. Now, just about CHOAM as well, Paul Atreides, when he takes on his new identity as the preacher in Children of Dune, here's something he wrote to CHOAM, and he says, "What you of the CHOAM Directorate seem unable to understand is that you seldom find real loyalties in commerce. When did you last hear of a clerk given his life for the company? Perhaps your deficiency rests in the false assumption that you can order men to think and cooperate. This has been the failure of everything from religions to general staffs throughout history. As to religions, I recommend a rereading of Thomas Aquinas. As to you of CHOAM, what nonsense you believe. Men must want to do things out of their own innermost drives. People, not commercial organizations or chains of command, are what make great civilizations work. Every civilization depends on the quality of the individuals it produces. If you over-organize humans, over-legalize them, suppress their urge to greatness, they cannot work and their civilization collapses." So there are various times throughout the Dune series where it just feels like Frank Herbert's manifesto. And the preacher in Children of Dune is one of his outlets, I believe. And also Leto II's journals in God Emperor literally just seem like his political manifesto. And there you can see the libertarian slant of Frank Herbert. And as you guys will know, if maybe you've spoke to some libertarians in your life, you can agree sometimes about like corporate control and corporate infringement. Where you disagree is often like the solution and on elements of capitalism. But you can see why you could maybe have a left-wing reading of the Dune franchise when it has this libertarian view on things like capitalism and how capitalism basically destroys the environment as well. So I do think Dune is quite compatible with a leftist reading, despite the fact that the author himself was a conservative libertarian. Now, I don't want to talk about this too much, but also the notion that Paul Atreides is the bad guy, and conservatives don't understand Dune because they like Paul Atreides, I think is generally from people on Twitter who haven't read the series, because I saw this take so much after Dune Part II came out, and conservatives were praising it and saying how much they liked it, which seemed kind of ironic because of the movie's more left-wing themes. But loads of people were saying, well, wait till they realise that Paul Atreides is the bad guy. And although people have said that's the goal of Dune Messiah, I think when you take the trilogy as a whole, it's very hard to see Paul Atreides as the villain or space Hitler, because he does compare himself to Hitler in one part of the book, but I think this is wildly taken out of context. Paul Atreides is a guy who can see the future extinction of humanity, but also knows if whether he dies or not is completely irrelevant to the global jihad that happens in his name, because so much stuff has been set in motion before he has even been born because of the Bene Gesserit breeding program and their own manipulation of these genetics in this time. He knows it's pretty pointless, and also Paul Atreides, unlike his son, chooses to not become the totalitarian dictator that his son does to save humanity, because he just can't live with himself doing that. And fundamentally, what humanizes Paul Atreides is he essentially dies when Chani dies giving birth. He becomes the preacher afterwards. He basically isn't Paul anymore. So even that reading is wrong. But I do understand, obviously, the problems of Orientalism in the series, the fetishization of Islam, just like smashing together loads of Islamic, Arab, Bedouin, Berber cultures together to create the space Muslim groups, written by a guy who was raised Christian, who is like a white American, and is fetishizing Islam, the Orient, in a very, very traditional way. He's very much romanticizing what he feels is like Islamic culture. And it's very clear that Frank Herbert likes this more traditional Islamic culture, because a through line in the first 4 books is that the Fremen become worse the more like westernized they become, the more they become the powerful group in the Imperium and subscribe more to like the Imperium's customs and forsaking Fremen culture, like the worse they become. And then you have like the museum Fremen in God Emperor that don't even remember their old ways until like one of the Duncan Idahos teaches them about it. So it's very clear that Herbert is more conservative in that way. But in terms of all the stuff to do with like breeding and genetics and stuff, I don't really know how to read that from his point of view. Like when I read it, I don't think it's like a good thing, but someone like Leto II does it to try and save like humanity. But let's move on to our pal Elon Musk first, who does very much like Dune. Like, it's been infamous for a while. He keeps like quoting and misquoting Dune. So even this year you had someone saying, is it ever explained in the books why House Atreides is so small? Leto doesn't have any siblings, cousins, part of the Bene Gesserit plan. Elon saying, I love Dune, but Frank Herbert, a genius writer, was obviously tripping balls writing that book. Can't expect total coherence in a situation like that. My guess is that he was high as fuck, lying on the lawn one day and saw an earthworm and thought, what if it was really big? So one thing I'm going to say about Elon is I think he might have read a lot of the Dune books and not understood any of the messaging of them. But yeah, I wouldn't say the most ridiculous part of the Dune series is Leto the First doesn't have cousins and relatives in the book itself, but he like probably does in the world, because lots of the minor houses have like loads of random nobles and stuff like that. So I'm sure there are people related to the Atreides. Then you have, you know, him posting his rocket back in 2018, quoting Frank Herbert, without change, something sleeps inside us and seldom awakens. The sleeper must awaken. He also misquoted Dune in 2022. Another one he posts, a Frank Herbert quote, all governments suffer a reoccurring problem. Power attracts pathological personalities. It is not that power corrupts, but that it is a magnetic to the corruptible. He says the power of government grows ever stronger with each passing year, posting a Tesla factory, the spice must flow. 2014 Dune series by Herbert is also brilliant. He advocates placing limits on machine intelligence. I mean, I haven't finished all 6 books, but I also don't think that's his message in the book so far, the first 4. But that's part of, obviously, the lore of the Dune books. Butlerian jihad, of course, happens 10,000 years before Paul Atreides is born, where they destroy all, like, thinking machines, and that's why you have mentats, which are essentially, like, human computers, because they've completely banned that. That's why you have the Space Guild, that's why you have the space navigators taking spice to drive, rather than some sort of computer doing it. And I'm going to talk about this in a second. I very much think Elon Musk views himself as Leto II from Dune God Emperor. But let's get into the mother of a couple of his children, Grimes, who is also like obsessed with Dune. So much so, I didn't know this. Her first album is actually called Gady Primes, which is obviously named after House Harkonnen's homeworld of Gady Prime. And every single song is basically named after something to do with Dune. The first song is called Caladan, the second Sardaukar, Levenbrecht, Zol, Face Dancer. The Face Dancers are a group introduced in Dune Messiah. Has a song called Fade Rafa, Dark Heart, obviously the nephew of the Baron. Has even a song called Shade Out Mapes, which is like a minor character in the Dune series. So it's pretty clear Grimes absolutely loves Dune. And also, Elon and Grimes originally bonded over their shared love for science fiction and AI. So it stands to reason that Elon probably has read the Dune books. He does like them, especially if he's tweeted about them before he had children with Grimes. And Grimes is really obsessed with them. Now, I want to talk about her own obsession with Dune first. So there was a big interview done where she spoke about why she likes it so much. So it says Grimes' first record was a Dune inspired concept album called Gady Primes, a reference to obviously the planet. Her father read Frank Herbert's book to her when she was 4. She loved it. At one Met Gala, she cornered Sting, who starred in David Lynch's adaptation. He was Fade Rafa in that one, and freaked him out with a heavy dose of Dune fangirling. For years, Grimes harbored a dream of directing her own adaptation of Dune, with the more problematic colonialist elements scrubbed out. I mean, what would even be good about that then? But when she heard about Denis Villeneuve's 2-part blockbuster, she fangirled all over again and signed up to help with the rollout, originally scheduled for November 2020. And then she adds she got cancelled from Dune because of the Communist Manifesto thing, where she had a picture of it. Not sure I believe that too much. She was crestfallen, but she understood there are things that are deeply not woke in the Dune universe, she says, so the studio had to be extra cautious, and she was far from indispensable. When she finally saw the movie, she realised to her astonishment that this story she'd adored since she was far too young for it, that she knew almost by heart, that inspired her first album, this story was now her story, specifically Lady Jessica's story. This goes by fast on screen, but Jessica is not a wife, but a concubine. Grimes saw herself in Jessica, and she saw X in Jessica's son, Paul Atreides. And obviously X is her son with Elon. Paul is more than a duke's son. He is a chosen one, tasked with becoming a great leader. When I see X, I know X is going to have to go through all this really fucked up shit that sort of mirrors Paul type stuff. I was just crying my eyes out the whole movie. She knows this might sound absurd, grandiose. She wishes it felt that way to her too. And obviously she was fangirling when the movie came out, tweeting, Fade Rafa is absolutely one of the all-time great villains. Society hasn't had a good one in a minute. The Joker has been done to death, though it's amazing. I've waited my whole life to see this brought to the screen faithfully. So obviously when she's saying she's Jessica and her son is Paul Atreides, who is Elon Musk in her mind? It's, Duke Leto the First. But I would disagree. I think Elon Musk views himself far more as Leto II. And that's for multiple reasons. So I used to say Elon Musk reminds me of Neander Wallace from Blade Runner 2049. Because Neander Wallace wants to basically create the ability for replicants to reproduce so humans could spread out endlessly among the stars. Basically colonize the whole galaxy, whatever, right? And they needed a slave labor force. So I used to say, and especially because Jared Leto said Neander Wallace was inspired by Elon Musk in part, I used to say Elon Musk's obsession with breeding is all down to this. Like, he wants this eternal labor force to make his dreams of colonizing the stars, including Mars, a reality. And obviously I still think he's a bit like that, but when I started reading Dune God Emperor, I was just kind of like, holy shit, like, this guy really reminds me of Elon Musk. So for the context of people who don't know what I'm talking about, Leto II is Paul Atreides' son. And in the book, Leto II decides to do what Paul can't. Paul didn't want to lead humanity on the golden path, which was save them from their own extinction, because he would have to become the God Emperor. And it's basically Leto II taking sand trout to make him into this like worm-human hybrid, which allows him to live for 3,500 years as he slowly transforms more and more into a worm.
So editing Kavernacle here, sorry about the audio quality. I've just watched this back as I'm editing. Thought I'd just give a brief explanation of what the Golden Path is, because I didn't think I made it very clear. Basically, Paul Atreides and Leto II can see the future, and they both see a potential terrible future coming for the human race, and they see multiple futures. And if you've seen the first Dune movie, you see Paul Atreides, I guess, visions of what could be, and they're not the exact same thing as what happens. So him and Leto II can both see what they will have to do to ensure the human race will survive for the future. Paul Atreides decides, I'm not going to do that because I don't want to become the God Emperor. I don't want to become the worm. Leto II, he's like, I am going to do this, and I will do all this terrible shit to ensure the survival of humanity. And that's what Leto ends up doing.
Now, during this time, he also carefully constructs a breeding program, starting with his twin sister and the grandson of the old emperor that Paul overthrew, to make sure House Atreides lived on, with the ultimate goal of creating humans where you couldn't actually predict their future. And at the end of God Emperor, Siona Atreides and Duncan Idaho kill Leto II, and his goal was basically served because he couldn't actually predict what Siona Atreides would do to him. So that is what the breeding program achieved. But he does all of this stuff to save humanity. Like, Leto II becomes the totalitarian dictator of the galaxy because he sees that as the only path to save humanity from extinction. Now, you also have things like the Bene Gesserit breeding program, where they like breed different groups of people to basically one day hopefully create someone like Paul Atreides, and it is Leto II who is this person who puts humanity on its golden path. But when I was reading all this stuff, this crazy stuff about Leto and how he justifies all the terrible shit he does, the breeding program, all the stuff he does to do with breeding. Like, it's not just the Atreides line, it's his own private army that he often breeds with Duncan Idaho Golas and stuff like that. And basically with Leto II's death, he causes the scattering, which is humanity basically going everywhere across the galaxy, colonizing the whole of space, because he's kept them so stagnated and under his control for so long. They're like yearning for freedom, and that's basically what happens. But I also think it's combined with like older stuff in Dune, just about the colonization of space. And I think the Golden Path thing, I sincerely believe Elon Musk has read Dune and thinks everything he does and all the bad things he does could be in service to a greater purpose in helping humanity colonize the stars. And that's why he's so obsessed with talking about population collapse, because to most people that's not an issue. We have plenty of humans already. We seriously don't need more humans on the earth generally. Of course, certain countries are having issues with population decline, but it isn't actually a global problem. But if you start thinking about this in terms of like, I need people to colonize the galaxy, I need people to work on my Mars colony, and I need to lead them into the future no matter what, I need to put them on the golden path to save humanity from climate change or whatever, I'm just going to be a terrible guy. I'm going to justify it in that way. I'm going to be this great man. And we all know these billionaires like to think of themselves in terms of like, you know, great man theory. They think they will be the ones to lead us into the future. And you've seen that Elon Musk doesn't have any morals. So could it be he uses his love of science fiction to justify like the terrible shit he's doing to like his workforce at places like SpaceX? maybe.
So editing Kavernacle back again very quickly, one massive thing I just forgot to say, just because this video is so vast in scope, I guess, and I had so many thoughts in my head. One thing I didn't touch on is the bloodline stuff in Dune is also about like intrinsic qualities you get from being from a certain gene pool. And it's very much like in a eugenics view of things. And even descendants of the Atreides going to like 3,000 years after Paul Atreides, they still have qualities of those types of Atreides because it's like passed down through generations, and Leto II like manipulates all of this stuff. And if I'm looking at it from Elon Musk's perspective, he has so many children and he doesn't look after his children. A lot of his children don't like him, but he probably thinks he's passing down his own brilliance to his children. And in that, just like in Dune, he will live on through all his children, in that they will essentially be mini Elons, regardless if they're in his life or not. And that's why it's so bizarre he feels like this, but you can see the appeal of Dune in that you can have loads of descendants and loads of kids, and they're just like you, but you've never had anything to do with their life, because in the, you know, the world of Dune, this is just the way, I guess, genetics works. And yeah, I forgot to talk about that, but it links back to the Matt Walsh stuff I was referencing earlier in the video.
Now, Elon Musk is a fascist. I have no problems calling him that, but he hasn't elaborated on his thoughts on Dune in a while, and he hasn't outlined what he particularly loves about it. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if he did think the breeding programs like were a good thing, and he sees like every action done by Leto and Paul as like absolutely justified. But it's not a new thing that fascists love Dune, and there's a good article by the Los Angeles Review of Books by Jordan S. Carroll called Race, Consciousness, Fascism and Frank Herbert's Dune. Dune was initially received as a countercultural parable warning against ecological devastation and autocratic rule, but geek fascists see the novel as a blueprint for the future. In a fascist reading of the novel, space colonization has scattered the human species, but what Herbert calls a race consciousness moves them to unite under Paul Atreides, who sweeps away all opposition in a jihad that kills 60 billion people. For the alt-right, Paul stands as the ideal of a sovereign ruler who violently overthrows a decadent regime to bring together Europid peoples into a single imperium or ethno-state. Dune ranks as one of Richard Spencer's favourite novels. Although Spencer styles himself as a prep these days, or like a neoliberal, he got his start in geek culture. Early in Spencer's career as the public face of fascism, he hosted the Vanguard radio podcast, where he regularly performed closed readings of science fiction texts with other reactionary intellectuals, such as Countercurrents editor Greg Johnson. During the Dune episode of Vanguard Radio, Spencer joined Johnson and John Morgan in lengthy dissections of Herbert's novel alongside the David Lynch movie. We see fascist ideas reflected in Dune. The Bene Gesserit sisterhood who bred Paul's bloodline for prescience submit him to a kind of deadly marshmallow test to determine if he is fully human. One threatens to kill him with the Gom Jabbar if he removes his hand from a device that produces the sensation of burning pain. Restraining his immediate impulses is only the first step towards using his precognitive abilities to choose between the possible timelines. As in fascist doctrine, Paul's ability to envision the future is a biogenetic trait possessed only by the worthy few. Paul's foresight helps him defeat a shadowy conspiracy, including the Spacing Guild, the House Harkonnen, figures the fascists characterize as greedy parasites representing either Middle Easterners or Jews. And also, just to cut in here, another point fascists love is that the Dune books are very homophobic. It's motivated by Herbert's own homophobia. Baron Harkonnen is not just gay, he's also a nonce, and he's, let's just say, someone who does that without consent, because that is the caricature Frank Herbert wanted to get across of gay people. Duncan Idaho in God Emperor has like a random outburst about how much he hates women in gay relationships. It's hard not to read that as like Frank Herbert jumping in himself. Continuing, once his antagonist's out the way, Paul uses this ability to carry out a multi-millennia plan for a civilizational renewal that requires him to sacrifice billions. As he worries about his grim destiny, Paul begins to look like the Germans in the 1930s, who pitied themselves for being forced to endure the difficult task of committing the mass killings to build the 1,000-year Reich. So there is a lot of like fashy shit in Dune, and if you don't really understand the message properly. Yeah, it's no wonder people will just like latch on to Paul Atreides as like this Eurocentric figure leading, House Atreides, which obviously means like sons of Atreus, and they do have ancestry going back to Greece, and the Harkonnens are inspired by Russia, but also, they have a Finnish name. Even though the emperor is called the Padishah Emperor, the Carino family do feel quite European as well. So for fascists, you could obviously read the feudal houses as stand-ins for Europeans, and Paul Atreides being European himself. But then what I don't understand with the fascist reading is they're so about like white race purity. The Fremen are so clearly space Muslims, and especially in the first book, it's pretty clear they are the good guys. And although Paul Atreides is like this Lawrence of Arabia figure, like his children are raised in Fremen culture and consider themselves Fremen. I read you, Leto Atreides says Allahu Akbar, right? So it's very clear his children become space Muslims as well. While the depiction of like this space Muslim faction is problematic in the book itself, Frank Herbert isn't really saying like Muslims, Arabs, like this culture is inferior. In fact, you could easily argue he's saying their culture is actually superior to the West, and he hates Western decadence as he sees it. And that's why the Fremen can just like destroy everyone in their path, because they adhere to this more traditional culture, which Frank Herbert likes. And just talking about this Islamic note as well, Haris A. Durrani wrote a good article for New Lines magazine called Frank Herbert, the Republican Salafist, which seems like an accurate description for him, but he had an interesting bit about his fetishization of Islam. So he writes here, one route into the puzzle is to ask how Herbert understood a single custom followed by the Fremen, namely the Amtul rule. The glossary for Dune defines the Amtul as a rule on primitive worlds under which something is tested to determine its limits or defect, commonly testing to its destruction. Jamis, a Fremen, invokes the rule to test whether Jessica, Paul's mother, is part of the legend of the leader who will come to the Fremen. The rule requires her to offer a champion to fight the one who invokes the rule, meaning Jamis in this case. If she is in fact part of the legend, her champion will kill the challenger in combat. In the novel, as in the film, Paul becomes his mother's champion and ultimately kills Jamis in a knife fight. So conceived, the Amtul rule resembles Mac Weber's Orientalist archetype of Quadi justice, that is, an arbitrary and brutal legal system absent in the rule of law. But Herbert actually liked the Amtul rule, and non-Western traditions in general. As Paul and his family reform Fremen customs in Dune and its sequels, the Fremen disconnect from their tradition, which I spoke about earlier. They grow increasingly legalistic, bureaucratic, and prone to fanaticism. They unthinkingly follow Paul on a jihad to conquer the universe, not because they abide by their customs, but rather because the reforms distance themselves from tradition. Thus, the novel romanticizes a monolithic, pre-colonial, pre-modern condition. It's not Quadi justice, but it is textbook Orientalism in the Romantic tradition. What is curious, however, is that Herbert may have imposed the Orientalist Romanticism onto his conservative understanding of America. In 1982, he praised Reagan for keeping that dream of the idealized America firmly in the mind, seeking to restore the individual to his preeminent position in society. According to Herbert's son, Brian, he disliked McCarthyism, and he was Joe McCarthy's cousin, because it endangered the central freedoms of the American people, particularly the constitutional rights of individuals. If the Dune novel sought to restore an essential non-Western tradition, Herbert also wanted to restore an essential American one. Collapsing Herbert's ideas of America and non-Western traditions, particularly Islam, is discombobulating. If the Fremen are savage adherents to Quadi justice, it's unclear who the savages are supposed to be in relation to their supposed saviour, Paul. Is Paul Lawrence of Arabia to the Fremen Bedouin, or is he Prophet Muhammad to the Quraysh whom he reformed, or to the later conflicts about his successors? In my mind, Paul Atreides is like Saladin, he's Prophet Muhammad, he's like these uniting Islamic figures, more so than someone like Lawrence of Arabia, but it is clear there is an influence there. And Frank Herbert's like love of Islam and these like Islamic, Arab, North African cultures just makes, in my mind, it so uncompatible with a Eurocentric, like fascist interpretation. But one thing we also have to talk about is why it's hard to read Dune in a fascist way is because Frank Herbert really, really hated like the government, he hated authority. So Paul Atreides isn't just inspired by like Lawrence of Arabia and Prophet Muhammad, he's also inspired by President Kennedy. because Frank Herbert obviously wrote this book during Kennedy's presidency and it was published after he was assassinated. But what he saw with President Kennedy is just this insane like cult of personality developing around a presidential candidate, then a president himself, and people just became so uncritical about someone like him. JFK was young, he was good looking, he was a good speaker, he was like a veteran in the Second World War. He essentially completely changed the image of the presidency in the 60s to something very, very glamorous, which really helped with his public persona. And when he was killed, it's still something like so many Americans remember, and so many Americans today, even older conservatives, they still talk about their love for JFK and they're so uncritical about it. Like I think of Oliver Stone, who's so critical of the US government, but he really loves JFK and he really believes the mythology of JFK. And it's kind of what like Herbert was criticizing, that people like Paul Atreides, who could be like JFK, they can lead you where they want if they have enough charisma and they have all these things, and you shouldn't trust authority. And in the same vein, Herbert also liked Richard Nixon being president the second time because he was so controversial and because he was so corrupt, obviously proven by like the Watergate scandal. He was happy, even though he was conservative and used to write like conservative speeches for conservative politicians, because people would start distrusting government leaders and start distrusting political leaders. And although you can easily read Dune as something that is like pro-revolution, pro-anti-imperialism, Frank Herbert also hated like anti-racist civil rights movements as well, because he believed people leading them like Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, or various others, he saw the danger in them, like a Paul Atreides or a JFK. He thought a lot of these people were just capitalizing on this social unrest for power. And that's like what Paul Atreides did with the Fremen. He took their desire for this prophecy and their unhappiness with what the Harkonnen had done, and he leads them into something and then uses them for his own ends. So Frank Herbert was just so skeptical of authority and power and messianic figures, or just like these figures who are larger than life, like JFK, Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Lawrence of Arabia. And that's what Dune is about in many ways. And that's why, in my mind, people like Elon Musk and Richard Spencer and other fascists loving Dune, I just don't see how it's compatible with the actual message of the book. And just to underline my point about like his politics. So Leto II has these journals that he writes. So thousands of years in the future, people will find them and realize why he was a totalitarian ruler. There's excerpts of it throughout the book, but it's pretty clear, like, this is Frank Herbert's manifesto. So here's one. Safaris through ancestral memories teach me many things. The patterns. Liberal bigots are the ones who trouble me most. I distrust the extremes. Scratch a conservative and you find someone who prefers the past over any future. Scratch a liberal and find a closet aristocrat. It's true. Liberal governments always develop into aristocracies. The bureaucracies betray the true intent of people who form such governments. Right from the first, the little people who formed the governments which promised to equalise the social burdens found themselves suddenly in the hands of bureaucratic aristocracies. Of course, all bureaucracies follow this pattern, but what a hypocrisy to find this even under a communised banner. Ah, well, if pattern teaches me anything, it's that patterns are repeated. My oppressions, by and large, are no worse than any of the others, and at least I teach a new lesson. Do you know what guerrillas often say? They claim that their rebellions are invulnerable to economic warfare because they have no economy, that they are parasitic on those that they would overthrow. The fools merely fail to assess the coin in which they must inevitably pay. You see it repeated in the systems of slavery, welfare states, caste-ridden religions, of socializing bureaucracies. In any system which creates and maintains dependencies, too long a parasite and you cannot exist without a host. And one more from a Bene Gesserit training manual, I think from the Children of Dune. Governments, if they endure, always tend increasingly towards aristocratic forms. No government in history has been known to evade this pattern, and as the aristocracy develops, government tends more and more to act exclusively in the interests of the ruling class, whether that class be hereditary royalty, oligarchs or financial empires, or entrenched bureaucracy. So Frank Herbert despised the government, he hated liberal bureaucracies, he hated socialism, he hated welfare states. Even though America was backwards then and still is, he hated like Medicare and Medicaid. He hated dependency on the government and wanted individualism above all else. And in that, you can see often how libertarian ends up in a fascist mindset. But most fascists do want this powerful authoritarian figure leading a very centralized state. And you can understand why fascists might latch on to Paul Atreides' Imperium in that way. But if they actually love the series, when you get to God Emperor, he runs a totalitarian government not because it's good, right? Leto II doesn't run a totalitarian empire because he thinks that's the best form of government. Because you think if the work was fascist, that's maybe what he would be saying. But basically what he's doing for 3,000 years, he's keeping all humans under such close control where he can see everything like Sauron's eye. He can see the future. He limits spice so people can't take it and they can't see the future like he can. He controls this to basically stagnate humanity and box them in. So they basically explode when he dies and go scattering, it's called the scattering, across the stars looking for freedom, looking to develop their own systems, their own political ideologies, and go far beyond the bounds of the known universe. And that's what happens after Leto II's death. And Leto II does this and creates like this libertarian world because he sees it as the only way humans can survive. And although I don't know if Frank Herbert would say 3,500 years of totalitarian government to do this would be worth it, I definitely would say it wouldn't be worth it. At the end of the day, he is saying that libertarianism is the key to humanity's survival. That's the message I took away from the first 4 Dune books. And things like centralized power, centralized monarchies, centralized imperiums, centralized empires run by people like Paul Atreides, that's bad. Things like the American Empire in this way are bad. It's more about individual rights, autonomy, freedom, and that's what he believed. So if you're a fascist reading the Dune books and think, oh yeah, I love this book because it shows me a good fascist world because of breeding programs and because of Paul Atreides and Leto, obviously you're completely not understanding the work of the author. And I do appreciate there is the death of the author with any work, especially something like Dune, but I just feel like, yeah, the message is libertarian. You can obviously read it in a more left-wing way. I just don't think it's very compatible with traditional fascist, viewpoint of the world. I don't think it's an endorsement of that system of government at all. In the same way, it's pretty clearly not an endorsement of a communist government, but what it's in opposition to, I think, is far more compatible with a left-wing reading of Dune than something like Elon Musk or Richard Spencer would latch onto. Like, yeah, colonization of space under like an authoritarian figure is what humans should aspire to do or something like that. But anyway, really long video. I hope it was coherent. I didn't script any of this. I'm just like off the top of my head and reading some screenshots. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. And let me know if you want me to do like a follow-up Lord of the Rings one. I would be happy to do that. And if you've made it this far, thank you for watching.